4 Palestine Action activists have been sentenced at Woolwich Crown Court today. Leona Eli Cameo, Charlotte Lottie Head and Fatima Zainab Rajwani were all convicted of criminal damage in May for destroying property at Elbit Systems Research Centre near Bristol in 2024. Cameo and Head were each sentenced to 6 years in custody. Wow. Rajwani to 5 years and 8 months. So those sentences just in 6 years and 5 years and 8 months. Samuel Corner is the fourth person sentenced. So he was convicted of criminal damage at that same trial earlier this year, also of grievous bodily harm, though without intent. That was for fracturing one of the vertebrae of an attending policewoman. Now, he's been sentenced to 8 years and 8 months in prison. Those are really long sentences. If you think the sentences for criminal damage seem long, that's because they are. Now, as Novara's Simon Childs reported from court today, the judge decided the activists would be sentenced as terrorists, despite never having been charged with a terror offence, a terror crime. That's because he found a terror connection in the action. So Simon, my colleague, reports this in his Novara media piece. Justice Jeremy Johnson told the Woolwich Crown Court that he found that defendants were well aware of the aims and strategy of Palestine Action, and that the raid was aimed at shutting down Elbit and ending what they regarded as British complicity in Israeli war crimes, and to intimidate it into ceasing operations or cause the government to prevent it from operating. The destruction of military assets was one part of a broader and more strategic purpose to shut down Elbit and put pressure on the government, he said. He cited the destruction to things which could not be described as weapons, including the smashing of a disabled toilet and the spraying of paint on the walls. I am bound by the legislation to find that the offence in each case has a terrorism connection, he said. Remarkable. We were watching some of the sentences or some of the sentencing statements while we were playing one of the previous interviews. And the judge kept sort of talking about how it was very clear that these people were intending to influence government policy and therefore it's terrorism. Now, I just thought that was what civil disobedience was, trying to influence government policy. And then he's saying, well, it's terrorism because they weren't just going for weapons, they also damaged a disabled toilet. Now, my definition of terrorism, and I don't think many people in the street, is damaging a disabled toilet. Anyway, moving on. Previously, Justice Johnson had held that the terror connection was partly based on the activists trying to influence the Israeli government. In the courtroom today, Johnson went back on that, saying it wasn't the Israeli government they were trying to influence, but the British one, aiming to pressure it to shut Elbit down in the UK. The terror connection means that the sentences are longer and that they're only eligible for parole much later. So that's very significant, actually. When I was reading out, those sentences, I was like, but they'll probably only serve half, right? That's how this works. But it sounds like the terror element means that might not be the case. Multiple human rights groups, legal professionals and politicians have spoken against the use of terror law in protest cases. And today, Amnesty International's UK chief said this: criminal damage has never been treated as terrorism within the UK justice system before, and it is completely disproportionate to do so because the offence occurred at a protest. A terrorism sentence carries restrictions that stay with a person for the rest of their life. We should all be worried about what this means for other individuals taking direct action in protest at a genocide or any other issue. After all, the right to protest is one of the most effective tools we have to hold our leaders to account. The use of terrorism laws to suppress direct action protesters sets a dangerous precedent for our fundamental rights in this country and must come to an end. Now, one thing that had been missing during the criminal trials was a list of the equipment damaged by the activists at the Elbit site. Elbit, as a reminder, is Israel's largest weapons manufacturer. Its biggest customer is the Israeli military. Now, according to the activists, they broke into the Filton facility to break up weapons and systems that could be used in Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. That was not something the judge allowed them to talk about to the jury. So they were barred from dwelling on their motivations for the attack in their evidence. The judge said that we shouldn't talk politics in this. No inventory of the smashed equipment was given to the jury either, even though the value of the goods destroyed was over £1 million. That list, though, of what they did destroy, so what they were actually targeting, did appear in today's sentencing hearings. This is the first time we've seen this. It appears to confirm that the Elbit site was, in fact, developing weapons, most likely for the Israeli military. was an Elbit advert for its Bird of Prey series of killing machines, an example of the kinds of autonomous drone made by the firm. Many similar drones were amongst the destroyed equipment at the site, with the barrister for Leona cameo making reference to the names of several models in open court. So they included autonomous 4 drones designed for use in frontline combat and used in Gaza for strikes and reconnaissance, according to the Jerusalem Post. And they also included in the damage were Elbit's Magni X drones, described on the firm's website as, quote, developed to provide the Israel Defense Forces with the most advanced close-range observation system. It is, the website brags, specially designed for the urban arena, providing day and night intelligence. Now, other destroyed were sentient Kestrel AI targeting systems. Sentient Kestrels, strange. They were that's the name of them, I suppose. They're not actually sentient, but sentient Kestrel AI targeting systems used to guide missiles to what are often human targets. Now, in total, 40 significant military assets were destroyed alongside lab equipment and computer systems. Banseka, I mean, many things to talk about. So sort of the details of the particular drones that were sort of revealed today. Obviously, there's suspicion that the reason the prosecution didn't provide that to the jury is because they didn't really want the jury to have in the forefront of their mind that these guys were damaging military equipment, which was going sort of to a place where tens of thousands of women and children and innocent men were being killed. Obviously, the jury also didn't know that they were convicted people of terrorism offences. The jury just were asked to make a decision: were these people guilty of criminal damage? The judge has come in afterwards, and they've now been upgraded to terror charges. And because they did criminal damage and tried to influence the government, suddenly they're terrorists in prison for, 4 to 8 years. Crazy.
I'm not comfortable with that slippage. I don't know how you feel, but it feels...
Well, between criminal damage and terrorism?
Yeah. And for a jury to be a de facto, maybe in the black and white letter of the law they're not, but de facto they have unknowingly sentenced them to terrorism charges, right? I'm not particularly comfortable with that particular slippage in the law. You've already made the point around civil disobedience. The raison d'etre of civil disobedience is, of course, to change policy. That's pretty much what it's meant to do. It's normally used as a way to protest and change laws that groups of people feel are unjust. And so this feels like a very, very uncomfortable overlap between where I think we should have something quite clear and distinct. You've kind of got 3 tiers here, right? You've got kind of what you might call lawful protest. Maybe that's going outside on a protest, for example. You've got civil disobedience, which, yes, may encroach into the realm of criminal damage. I don't think anyone is disagreeing, probably, that they have engaged in criminal damage, and they probably knowingly engaged in criminal damage. They know what they were doing, but they believed that they were doing it for just reasons. And frankly, I would agree with them looking at the nature of those machines, those killing machines. And then you've got this third tier of terrorism charges. And I'm very uncomfortable with the way in which we seem to be collapsing these 3 together more and more, I have to say. It also worries me as well that, I do feel like with this slippage between the 2, it also has an impact on policing as well, and how police may see these types of prospective groups that are engaging in civil disobedience. They may also see that as a reason to engage in things like more surveillance tactics, for example, through a kind of counter-terrorism lens. Perhaps they're going to exercise things like stop and search powers more restrictions on assemblies, monitoring of organisers. So whilst I don't wish to be hyperbolic and say no one's going to be able to protest from now, of course not, but it does feel like these slippages between what I think should, from a democracy point of view, be quite separate categories, are kind of melding together a little bit more. And what does that say, I suppose, about where our democracy is heading and the confidence of people to go out and protest against things that they believe are unjust? The other thing as well, which me and you were talking about earlier on, is that there's an odd juxtaposition between this case and what we've seen the outcomes of in Belfast, where we've had people rioting, engaging in racist rioting, targeting of ordinary members of the public because they are black or brown, because they're perceived to be migrants, different, not from here. Those people have been sentenced, I think, quite quickly, but they've been sentenced under the criminal realm, right? They're not sentenced under terrorism, although from what we've described, you could potentially, if we're going to say that this is potentially terrorism, then why not the rioters in Belfast? They're rioting for very specific political reasons. They're endangering, clearly members of the public, setting someone's house on fire, as Beverly denied on GB News, setting someone's house on fire. You're endangering people, in the public for very explicitly political reasons. So this conversation about two-tier justice, we can have a deeper conversation about some of the disparities in our criminal justice system, of which there are many, but this two-tier justice system, which the right like to talk about as though somehow right-coded causes are, treated far more draconianly, whereas left-wing causes are given kind of carte blanche to run, that doesn't seem to be the case. And this particular incident today, these juxtaposition of these two things seems to really exemplify that their perspective on two-tier justice is not really true.
Well, and I suppose the common thread is that, and this is explicit in the law, is that when things are associated with political disorder, that's an aggravating factor. So people are always like, why did this guy go to prison for 2 years for a tweet? It's because it's associated with political disorder, and that's an aggravating factor. This is just more than an aggravating factor, though, because this is like a terrorism connection. I'm just going to, because this is all breaking news, I want to be careful that I'm sort of giving you the precise correct information. I'm not that steeped in legalese. So I'm just getting some sort of clarifications and updates from my colleague, Stephen, who says, be careful calling these terror charges because they're criminal charges with the terror connection and aggravating factor. Okay. So they haven't been convicted of terrorism charges. Mm-hmm. They've been convicted of criminal charges, and then the judge has sort of decided that a terrorism connection was an aggravating factor. Just to remind you of the length of their various sentences. So for Cameo and Head, 6 years each. That's criminal damage with this, terrorism connection. For Rajwani, 5 years, 8 months. And then for Corner, 8 years and 8 months. That's for criminal damage. And then the grievous bodily harm served consecutively. And then I've asked Stephen about when they'd be eligible for parole. So sort of what's the sort of minimum sentence they'll serve. And Stephen has informed me almost 5 years before parole for the three women and 7 years, 8 months for Corner. So that's an extraordinarily long sentence. I'm supposed to go back to the issue of sort of how criminal damage with intent to influence government policy has suddenly become terrorism. Because I'm a fairly moderate social democrat now, but I used to be more of an anarchist when I was younger. And I broke into Stansted runway and stopped a bunch of planes taking off, against airport expansion. It was like my climate activism days. And clearly that was quite extreme criminal damage, very explicitly to affect government policy. Now, I got community service for that.
Right.
Because, and we thought we were just going to get a fine. Got 50 hours community service. Because it was called aggravated trespass at the time, which, it was aggravated. It was trespass when you're trying to stop someone doing their legally, the thing that they have a legal right to do. I was never out, I wasn't like, how dare you arrest me for this? I knew I was committing a crime. Yeah. And I knew that I was going to serve some kind of sentence for it. And I was fine with that. But if they'd sort of, and presumably that's what these Palestine Action people were sort of expecting.
I think so.
If they'd slapped on a terrorism charge to me for that could have ruined my whole life.
Yeah.
It probably would have ruined my whole life.
Yeah.
Right? So the fact that sort of after the fact, what by most people's understanding is criminal damage to affect a political outcome, or, in one case, grievous bodily harm, which I'm not outraged that these people got found guilty of this, right? If it would have been fantastic if the jury could have been told the full information and they could have been told sort of the political motivations, and then maybe, like we have seen in previous cases with the Colston statute, for example, the jury do acquit the defendants because they're like, we can kind of see what you did was on the face of it illegal, but we think you were stopping a bigger crime. I think the jury should have been told that. But if the jury had then decided, well, we've taken all this into account, but we still think it's criminal damage, come on, I would have not been that outraged. I think the people taking part in it would have expected that. But for this terror charge, which just doesn't ring true, I think you ask anyone in the street, what's terrorism? And they say, oh, it's smashing up a disabled toilet when you want to change government policy. That's not terrorism, that's criminal damage.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the fact that you want to change government policy has never really been considered an aggravating factor.
It's very, very strange. I mean, I don't know enough about it. I probably shouldn't confess. I do have a law degree.
I warned that I was going to bring that up, and you told me not to.
I graduated 10 years ago, guys. So, and unfortunately, I don't have a lot of expertise around sort of terrorism charges and things like criminal damage. But it does seem I'm quite baffled, actually, and maybe you have a better insight than me, as to why they are not. Is it at the judge's discretion for them not to tell the jury about particular facts of the case? Is that discretionary on the judge's behalf?
So again, I shouldn't say this either, but I'm not like a legal expert. Stephen's the one who's very good at all of this stuff. But my understanding is that basically after lots of the Extinction Rebellion stuff, and the Just Stop Oil stuff, and the Insulate Britain, the blocking the cars stuff, basically the government wanted to get much tougher on this stuff, and they wanted sort of judges, prosecutors, and juries to be more harsh about it. And that meant that they got, and especially the Colston people getting sort of not found not guilty. They got much more strict in terms of getting judges to say what is admissible and what's not admissible. We don't want them to give their political justification. You have to be clear to the jury that all they're judging on is the legal facts of the matter without any politics involved. And then the judge gets to decide what's admissible and what's inadmissible. And deciding what's admissible and inadmissible is normal in a court. So often, if you're tried for, one crime, shoplifting or grievous bodily harm or whatever, the judge won't allow the prosecution to tell the jury that you've also committed a few crimes in the past, because they'll say that will prejudge their outcome. So having admissible and inadmissible things is perfectly reasonable for a judge to say. But clearly there's been a political decision to say, we want to throw the book at these people. And the terrorism charge is a new thing beyond, obviously, what Extinction Rebellion faced.
Yeah.
And that's where Israel comes in, right? It's that there's a foreign policy establishment. We know the government seems to be very willing to break precedent when it comes to Israel, and that's what seems to have happened here.
Yeah.
Apparently, Stephen's telling me, as they left the dock, Charlotte Head shouted, "In order to hear the birds, the warplanes must be silent." So obviously, these people who are now going to prison for a very long time, unsurprisingly, still very much believe in the rightness of what they did.
I mean, it's interesting because when you study law, like one of the first principles you learn in sort of criminal law is like mens rea, which is intent and intention. What was the intention? And it's normally to try and draw a line between, I suppose, did this person actually intend to do X, Y, and Z? Intent is the kind of key factor that you normally have to establish, quote unquote, beyond reasonable doubt in our legal system. And so it strikes me as quite odd to kind of revert against that way of thinking in our legal system, which we have a long legal precedent for, to say that key aspects of intention are now just not relevant if they're to do with politics. That, to me, instinctively doesn't feel right, doesn't feel correct. It feels like it's missing a crucial piece of context that I think potentially a jury might feel quite guilty about having not had access to. I can't imagine being on that jury, realizing afterwards and being like, oh God, and now I've de facto sent these people down for
a really long time.
For a really long time as well. That doesn't feel like a particularly healthy aspect to our judiciary. And I'm worried about the ways in which individual judges may be able to, have a lot of discretion about how they interpret what they will or won't keep in a court case that's relevant for juries.
We've got a little bit more to this story, actually. There were large protests outside Woolwich Crown Court today as the sentencing hearing was underway inside. So hundreds of demonstrators turned up to support the Filton Four, waving flags, banging drums, and calling for justice. And 72 people were arrested under the Terror Act for holding up signs reading, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action," as part of that silent vigil. Okay, so that's also happened today, so that's significant. Now, that sentence, you'll have heard it before, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." That's apparently prescribed under the Terror Act following the banning of Palestine Action as a terror group by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper last year. Now, in a judicial review, Palestine Action co-founder Huda Amouri successfully argued that the ban was unlawful, with the court agreeing with her. Nonetheless, the ban remains in force while the government appeals that decision. So even though a court has decided it was unlawful, you still can't hold up that banner without getting arrested until The appeal is heard. Now, the result of that will be published on Monday. So we'll obviously be reporting on that on Monday. One of those arrested for holding up a bit of paper told reporters what he made of it all.
Anything to say, friend? Anything to say?
What? How ridiculous. Yeah, how ridiculous.
Another image of like a really lovely older person that we've seen so many times getting arrested for holding up a bit of paper saying that they oppose genocide and they support a group which commits civil disobedience to try and stop a genocide. Banseka, we're going to wrap up very soon. I suppose the question I wanted to ask you is not so much a legal one, even though you've got your legal degree, but I do feel like neither of us feel like we can speak with quite enough authority when it comes to the judicial process. I want to talk about the politics of this, which is there's going to be a new prime minister soon, quite possibly going to be Andy Burnham. Do you think he is going to sort of continue with Labour's sort of very authoritarian course when it comes to Palestine Action? Because he could become prime minister and say, oh, the whole prescribing Palestine Action, that was a mistake. Obviously, whether or not it might be that the courts decide that actually it was lawful. It might be that they decide it's unlawful. But if the courts decide it's unlawful, then the government is free to go away and come back with a new case for it. To say, okay, maybe we didn't do the process properly, but here's a new case. We still want to prescribe it. Or the government can say, okay, we give up now. It's legal. What do you think Andy Burnham will do if he becomes prime minister?
Yeah, I don't think we've had any indication whatsoever that Andy Burnham will be particularly divergent from the current status quo of the Labour Party on these particular issues. I think when it comes to immigration, law and order, foreign policy, particularly foreign policy around Palestine and Israel, Andy Burnham seems to fall largely into line. The things that he's been more divergent on, I think, have been a bit more to do with economics, wealth redistribution, those types of things. Although you could make an argument and say Keir Starmer's done some of that stuff. He's not been entirely right-wing on everything the whole time necessarily. So I don't think we've had any evidence that Andy Burnham is going to be particularly divergent on these issues. I know his background with links to, supporting the Iraq War and things like that has left a bad taste, perhaps rightfully so, in people's mouths. And I do just think ideologically, this concept of Manchesterism gets bandied about quite a lot. Suddenly the Westminster Commentariat is an expert in Manchesterism, quote unquote, whatever that is. I don't think I know really. And there's a good case to say some local journalists who've done some interesting work around Andy Burnham over the last several years have said it doesn't really amount to a lot. It's a bit vibes-based. It's a bit of a feeling. It's a bit of an anti-Westminster vibe, anti-Westminster feeling. But when you get down to some of the specifics, it's not really a lot at all. Andy Burnham strikes me as a politician who's capable of capturing perhaps a certain mood, a certain understanding of people emotionally, perhaps somewhat intuitively, which Keir Starmer admittedly doesn't have. I don't think he has that. But I do not think when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of things, when it comes down to the specifics, when it comes down to who he's facing, not just externally outside of the Labour Party, but internally within the party, is he really going to have like the chutzpah to take those kind of establishment kind of takes on and dismantle them? I don't think so. He's talking about having Josh Simons in his team.
So I'll put forward the case for why there might be a change.
Go on.
But I'm not exactly predicting it. And I'm going to be very clear. It's not because Andy Burnham is like an incredibly principled, brave person who's really willing to sort of incur political costs for the liberation of the Palestinians. I don't think there's much in his political career that really suggests that's in his nature.
No.
The argument why I think there might be a pivot is because Andy Burnham has to do something to show that he's different from Keir Starmer and to appeal to left-wing voters. Now, I don't think he will shift on immigration because I think that's too costly electorally among voters who are reform curious. I think there's a limit to what he's going to be able to do economically because of the bond markets. So I do think that one thing he can sort of demonstrate a significant shift to the left on without really upsetting any voters, because voters don't like Israel, and without upsetting the bond markets, because bond markets don't care about Israel, is shifting the government's position on Palestine. So I do think that there is a pragmatic, almost cynical reason why Andy Burnham might have a big shift on Palestine, because it's a cost-free, both electorally and financially, way to indicate to the left, who are green curious or already gone to the Greens, that you are different from the man who came before, who they all hate.
Yeah, and I think Novara posted some data. I think your colleague Harriet Williamson posted some data that Gaza was like the number one issue for people leaving the Labour Party as well.
100%. You can tell that by meeting people in the street, right? There's so many people who've gone to the Greens because they just think it's despicable how Labour have dealt with this.
I'm wondering on a practical sense how he shores up a basis for that. Because one of the other things about him coming into power is that if it happens, he'll have a cabinet presumably still stuffed with people who have been quite, complicit in the current status quo, the current position on Israel. How does he get those people on board? How does he shore up their support? Does he replace them? In which case, replace them with who? Because it feels like the broader Labour Party, despite having so many MPs, it feels quite dearth for talent, really. So that's tricky there. I'm wondering how he shores up that support within his cabinet, because the thing is, you can't just go in there as a single individual and be amazing, right? Like, it'd be great if you could, because it'd make things a lot easier.
And also, he's not going to be that anyway.
No, he's not going to be that guy anyway, by the way.